Well, good morning, guys. It's I know you're all busy. We're all busy, and so anytime you take time away from your normal job to come do something like this, I always appreciate the time with you guys. And hopefully, by the end of this, you've learned a few things, maybe learned some new ways to ask some different questions about the development happening in your community. But more than anything else, I really do believe this, and I'll start with this. I don't have to reintroduce myself because Molly did that long introduction, but I would challenge you guys to think about this statement. We are building cities that we can't afford to live in, i.e. affordable housing, skyrocketing property values, et cetera, and maintain from the city's perspective, infrastructure costs, service costs, et cetera. I did not used to think like this, by the way. As a trained engineer, out of school, we're taught growth is good, expansion is good. You design roads and bridges and highways and everything to accommodate growth. What we're not taught in engineering school is how are you going to pay for things after the development community puts them in. And what I saw in, Molly referenced my little stint as national director for my former firm's community planning group. And what I saw in that time of traveling and working around the country and then coming back to Dallas where I'm based, I started to ask the question and see, no matter where I went, big city, small city, rural, urban, suburban, no matter where I went, very few cities had the money that they needed to pay for their infrastructure and services. It was always an effort of scaling it back to fit what they had. And as I started to study it a little bit more, you realize that what we're doing in Texas, in a lot of ways, is going to put us in the same place as a lot of these other communities are in today. So that was a big kind of the aha moment for me of why we started Verdunity back in 2011. We've evolved a little bit as a firm from more of a design firm initially to more of a planning and consulting firm now. We do a lot of strategic plans, comp plans, council workshops, things like that to educate about this topic. But ultimately, it's about building places that we can sustain long-term. I've got two kiddos, and that's why I'm doing it. I want to make this place better and more affordable for them, and what I see right now is it's a train wreck. So I always like to start with this about our firm. Prosperity does not come from endless new growth. It's cultivated incrementally by the people that live and work there. You don't achieve long-term prosperity by a 10 or a 20-year growth spurt where you build out your entire city over 1 or 2 decades. You build it by growing incrementally over time and keeping the people that you have and attracting more people to you. When you look at a city's strategic plan, comp plan, website, most cities will say some version of this. We want to be fiscally sustainable or fiscally responsible. We want to be environmentally resilient. We want to be socially inclusive and diverse and equitable. But when we look at the daily decisions that our cities are making, when we look at the projects that we approve, when we look at the infrastructure that we're building, they rarely align with those outcomes. They help us accomplish short-term goals of how do we increase our taxes or how do we add people or how do we move cars around better today, but they don't always consider the long-term impacts and especially the fiscal ones, which is what I'm going to drill into. This is an old slide. I haven't taken time to update it, but it was a big one that I saw back in 2009, 2010. Bankruptcies around the country and local government. Everybody knows about Detroit. San Bernardino is an interesting one. I actually lived there. My dad worked for Shell growing up, so we traveled all over the place. We lived in San Bernardino in the late 70s. And at that time, San Bernardino was best place to live, work, play. Everybody was moving there, building new subdivisions, new schools, new businesses. In 2011, they declared bankruptcy, and they've started over. I asked my dad several years ago, I was like, what was it like? Can you compare San Bernardino to somewhere in North Texas? I live in Rockwall, got one sister in Allen, one city in McKinney. So my parents know North Texas well. They're up here a lot for the grandkids. But I asked my dad, what was San Bernardino like then? Can you compare it to somewhere now? And he's like, yeah. He's like, back then it was exactly like McKinney, Allen, Rockwall, Frisco. Maybe not to the scale that Frisco is blowing up, but it was the best place to live, work, play that part of California was a rapidly growing area in the late 70s. You can see some other ones. There's a lot more of these that are kind of just under the surface. They're just barely getting by. Places like Memphis, places like Ferguson, Missouri, places like Chicago, a lot of places in Illinois. Unfortunately, I was born in St. Louis. I have a lot of family in Illinois, so I keep track of that group. But on top of the fragile local government budgets that we have going on, we also have this happening on the private side, right? We've got increasing personal debt. You go dig inside families and you see how many people are just living paycheck to paycheck. And so when our property values go up just a little bit, right? When the cost of living goes up just a little bit, when gas prices go up just a little bit, what do we hear? There's a lot of pushback of, I can't afford that. You're pricing me out of my home, right? There's a lot of people that are teetering right on that line of having everything that they've had at that same price point. And if we go up a little bit above that, you price a lot of people out. And I would argue for a lot of the places in North Texas, especially the newer places that are growing now, it's not necessarily a fiscal sustainability thing for you, as I'm going to talk about more, because your home values are so high that they will cover the costs. It's more of an affordability question of how many people can really afford a $600,000, $700,000 house, right? And for those who can't, where are they going to go? Because we've had such resistance to building the kind of housing that those folks are ultimately going to need. So you have this, you've got increasing housing and affordability gaps. We all know what the home prices are doing right now. The same thing, if there's a lot of, some people kind of don't like when I say this, but there are a lot of similarities between California in the late 70s, early 80s, and Texas today. Things like the property tax cap, things like expanding the roadway system, things like building out a ton of single family neighborhoods quickly, right? What they're suffering through today is, hopefully we learn from that and we do things differently, and we've done a few things differently in Texas, but we still need to look at this housing and development pattern and really shift it more to ultimately end up in a better place than our friends to the west have. This is the big one that really kind of, the light bulb for me as a civil engineer, and what I talked about earlier of understanding infrastructure. It's the hidden cost of infrastructure. It's not what it costs to build it today, right? It's what does it cost to rebuild it 40 or 50 years later when that street is at the end of its life and it has to be rebuilt, right? We think about what does it cost to build today? What do we need for preventative maintenance? My friend Jim over here from the public works side knows preventative maintenance and how do you extend the life of our roads. But ultimately they have to be rebuilt. And our cities do not have anywhere near the money that they need to do that. You also have safety issues, right? This drives me bonkers that we see these things on the news of all of these other things that are killing people in this country. This one kills as many or more than any shooting, any airplane crash, any train crash. It's this one. But for whatever reason, we just say, if it's deaths on our roads, that's like business as usual. Doesn't matter. I'd say, I bet it would matter to you if it was your kid, if it was somebody in your family, right? And this is somebody that a close friend of mine, Chuck Marone from Strong Towns, has really, really pushed for, and he actually just had to retire from engineering because the Minnesota board was threatening to take away his license. Engineers, we have an ethic obligation to design our streets to stop this. And if you're working with engineers that don't take this seriously, then that's kind of on you too. Because the way we design our roads allows for more of these crashes to happen and more of these fatalities to happen. And they're not accidents, they're crashes. This can be stopped with good street design. This is probably the biggest one in today's world that North Texas communities are struggling with. We have outdated standards, engineering standards, but also just community design standards, zoning codes that prioritize that, right? They prioritize bigger lots, they prioritize the hierarchical road system of you've got thoroughfares and you've got the little roads that lead to bigger roads. Everything in our cities up until probably the last 3 or 4 years in Texas was was everything in our design standards was around building auto-centric places. And when you come in and you try to build something differently, it's very, very hard to get through that wall. And that's the place that really we jumped into 3 or 4 years ago to do more education about this. Not necessarily because any one of these things I just pointed out they're elements of why things are broken when you really stop and think about we have all of these problems, but it's all of them together. And it's like we can't solve any one of these, or definitely all of them, without a significant change in our development pattern. And we can't change the way we're developing until we educate more people. Because most people that you talk with, even people in the field of planning development, they don't really understand why things are broken. They don't really understand why things need to change. So until you help them understand why, they're not even going to listen to how. They're not even going to listen to some of the best practices that you can do to change it. So in our work, what I saw traveling the country, working with cities all over the country, and now back in Texas and in our southern region here, we have these fragile local economies that go up and down. We've got escalating service costs, especially infrastructure. We've got residents that are more and more disconnected, whether it's apathy, whether it's frustration. There's different ways that they're checking out, right? And at the same time, when you go inside City Hall, there's frustrated city staff, especially in planning, to some extent in economic development, and definitely at the city management level, I think, where they know we're administering these policies. We have these policies that are leading to these outcomes, creating more generic places that all look the same, that ultimately our citizens and our businesses struggle to connect with and invest in, right? I've been to a lot of different cities around this country, and there's one part in every city that you can kind of get a feel for where you are, or that makes it look different than everywhere else. Does anybody have an idea where that is? Downtown, right? If you get out of a city's downtown, if I were to blindfold you and drop you down in a neighborhood, typical thoroughfare corridor, whatever it may be, and take the blindfold off and you look around, you would probably not be able to tell where you are, because everywhere's got the Starbucks, the McDonald's, the Home Depot. They all look the same, right? So it's really, really critical that you have that downtown that's your kind of your anchor to differentiate you and bring more people in. But part of it is like, why does it have to be just our downtown? Why can't it be more of the neighborhoods and some of that? And we're starting to see a return to that, of more neighborhoods that we can connect with and ultimately reinvest in. You want to build a resilient city, build a place where people want to stay. Not just come initially, but build a place where they can and want and can afford to stay, whether that's a resident or a business. Over 10 years now, probably close to 15 years now, I've been asking this question of city managers, council that we work with, different surveys that we've done on projects. When it comes to growth and development in your community, what's the biggest challenge or frustration that you're dealing with? Some version of this. How do we address the growing wants and needs of our residents with limited resources? If you drill down a little bit more, a lot of them will say infrastructure. If they're an older city, they'll definitely say infrastructure. If it's a newer city, they'll probably say managing growth and trying to get better quality development from the development community. So we need a common language to talk about these common problems and ultimately get to common solutions. I believe that fiscal sustainability can be that common language. Somebody, an individual that we might talk with, I say something like a road diet to reduce the lanes or add a bike lane or a complete street or something like that. Goes right over their head, right? They don't understand technically what that means. Density. Some people may or may not know what that word means or have a certain definition of what that word means. But when you put things in terms of what does it cost? What is the impact on your tax rate? What is the impact on your property value? When you can put all of these development things through that lens, we found that more people will connect to it, and it becomes a more productive conversation about where and how and when you do things, as opposed to, heck no, I don't want it, which is a really, really big shift that you've got to be able to make in your community. So this was the question that I was asking, I still ask and still working on. But with all the growth, with all the prosperity that we have in our country, why do our cities continue to struggle to pay for basic services, and why are income gaps and poverty levels continuing to increase? How many of you in here are familiar with strong towns? Strong towns? I see a few people. Okay. Strongtowns.org, if you want to go look them up. It's a nonprofit. I mentioned Chuck a minute ago, but they've been at it right about a year longer than we have as Verdunity. They started officially back in 2010. But one of the things that Chuck talks about in his early books and is kind of the genesis of everything that they're doing today is this idea of the Suburban Experiment. And what I was mentioning earlier of post-World War II, since the invention of the car and some of the housing policies that were put in place after the war, our cities across this country have aggressively pursued fast growth, higher quality of life in the short term without fully considering the long-term costs and impacts. And what about growth, or what about maintenance after growth? These are real pictures, these are real places. And you see more and more and more places like this around our country, right? And what the Suburban Experiment, what Chuck talks about is, and I'll get into this more in a second, but it's basically once we invented the car, more land was easier to access, it was cheaper to access, and so all of a sudden you saw developers go gobble up a big chunk of land and build, 100, 1,000, 10 acres, 20 acres, 100 acres of development all at once. Versus how we had built our cities for hundreds of years before that. When I first built this chart, I had no idea that this was going to catch on as well as it has, and I still look at it sometimes and it's kind of confusing, but I guess it's not, because this is the most popular slide that people ask for me after. So every city starts on the left of this chart. You're a small population, you're a small town. There's some of you in this room that are in this place right now, right? You're a smaller community, you have maybe a main street or a courthouse, somewhere where your city started. People moved there, they built the town, they started the town. And you move to the right a little bit, and so that initial infrastructure that you built your city around starts to get older, right? And then you enter this middle part, which is your turn to grow. The market has come to you, the population has come to you, and all of a sudden here come all the developers, right? They're buying up all the land, and you're building a ton of new subdivisions and new development in a short amount of time. Typically that middle phase is around 15 to 20 years. They come in, they gobble it all up, and they crank out a ton of new neighborhoods, and with the new homes come the streets, the water, the sewer, the drainage, the parks, the schools, everything that comes with it, right? This is the phase that Chuck would call the illusion of wealth. This is best place to live, work, playtime. When you're driving around the community, most of what you see looks new, right? It's kind of shiny, it's new, it's the new restaurant, it's where everybody wants to be. But you still have that older part, where your town or where your city originally started. But the revenue from the new growth allows you to take care of that old stuff because there's not that much of it, right? And so you take care of old infrastructure, you take care of some older neighborhoods, you're continuing to grow, and what do our councils do when we have excess revenue? What does council want to do? Lower the tax rate, right? Look at us, we can give you everything that you've been getting, and we have this surplus because of property tax and sales tax growth, and so we can lower that tax rate for you. But as you push to the right of this, eventually you start to run out of land to develop, right? And what is happening in a lot of places is as you start to run out of land for the greenfield development, and so greenfield or development starts to slow down, so your revenue from new development, impact fees, additional property tax revenue, additional sales tax for more people, all of that starts to flatten out, right? Anybody know how long a road typically lasts?
Depends on where you're at, what part of the country, but about 20 years is...
Okay, 20 for asphalt, 40 for concrete if it was built well. Maybe you can get to 60 in today's world if it's built well and maintained well, right? Maybe. But back in the days, when developers were cranking out stuff in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, it wasn't the highest quality stuff, right? So let's say let's use kind of North Texas. When was the big growth boom for some of our first ring communities, like a Richardson or Plano or somewhere like that? 60s and 70s, right? So how long do those roads last? 20, maybe 40 years? So what happens, you get over here and your city runs out of land to develop, and at the same time, the wave of reconstruction to build all of that infrastructure that was built in your growth boom 10 or 20 years earlier hits you in like 5 years. And cities have not, they have not been looking for it. This is Detroit, this is Ferguson, Missouri, this is Chicago, this is Memphis, Tennessee, this is Shreveport, Louisiana. They're all over this country. And so my mission in starting Verdunity was to help Texas flatten this out so that we can use the growth smarter and better so that we don't end up upside down when we're built out. So how do places, every one of you in here is in a growing community, I think, or will be growing at some point, right? So my challenge to you is how do you grow differently so that 40 years later when you're gone, your council is not going, what in the hell were those people 40 or 50 years earlier doing? Because one of the things I want to do on podcasts is get a group of people of council members today and their council members from previous years, if they're still around, and have that conversation. Because the few times I've actually been able to get in the middle of that, of someone that was an active council member 20 or 30 years ago and someone that's trying to navigate this today in a built out place, it's fascinating to hear what just that conversation. But this is what it's all about. This is the Suburban Experiment. This is the illusion of wealth. This is what we're talking about, is how can you grow differently and how can you think about the future costs of infrastructure in a way that you can use development today to level that out and not be so upside down in the future. One of the ways you do that is just your footprint of your growth. This is a chart or a map from Victoria, Texas that we worked with a couple of years ago. I love this map because it's very clear to illustrate this topic. The green area, the dark green area right there in the middle, that's their old downtown, the old historic part of Victoria, Texas, down southwest of Houston. I think it goes all the way up to 1940-ish. So very compact, gridded streets, smaller lots. And then you see 1950 and on. So look at how much land area they expanded to in the next 60 plus years, right? They had this real small pattern, and then 1950, boom. So that top part there, in 65 years, between 1950 and 2015, their service area grew by 13 times, but their population only grew by 4 times. So what that does is, as you expand outward, right, and we have this conversation in Texas communities about annexation, and now we can't do it by right as much, but there was always this thing of let's go annex it and add more land so that we can develop it later. But when you build out like this, you're adding more roads, you're adding water and sewer and pump stations and fire stations and all of the service costs that go with it. But that old pattern was much more dense, right? Density is not a bad word when it's done well, right? The more people you have in an area, the more you can distribute those service costs around more people and more households. When you spread them out, which is what the new pattern does, is we add a lot of people, but we do it in a much bigger footprint. And so that cost burden per person or per household goes up over time. So is there a better, smarter way to develop, to align our services and our development pattern with what residents are willing and able to pay for, not just now, but in the future? And these are a few slides from Chuck at Strong Towns that illustrate this again. And it's the historic development pattern. It's the way we built our cities pre-World War II, pre-invention of the car. Not to say that the car is bad, but we have to think about the costs, the long-term service costs of that infrastructure that takes. This is what I mentioned, small Main Street, few people show up. They build something, there's no loans, there's no debt. We do it as we have the resources, and the people there were the ones that took the risk to build it. Over time, that street turned into this, right? Incrementally, they invested a little bit more. Chuck always uses the term incrementally out, incrementally up, incrementally more intense. So they would build out a block, they would say, oh, there's more people, we need a little bit more. They would go the next block out, and they would build another few buildings. right? They would never extend themselves beyond what they had people or resources to build. There's another slide in Chuck's longer presentation, unfortunately and sadly, that shows this street today. It is a 4-lane road with empty parking lots on both sides. The entire street has been obliterated for big box development that is now no longer there. But so this was built incrementally with the resources that we had. This is my favorite street. This is from Indianapolis, Indiana, a place that we did some workshops a few years ago. Look how wide that street is. Could you build that street in your city today? Nope, right? I mean, not only is it narrow, you have cars parked on the side. What would somebody in a public meeting with that street today say? I can't, where do I go? I can't drive through there. I can't, I have to slow down and like take turns passing somebody. Yeah. You know what a narrow street does? It slows the cars down. You know what happens when cars on a local street drive slow? Kids play in the front yard. Kids are allowed to bike and ride, to the park. You know what happens when streets are wide? Cars drive crazy fast, especially teenagers in today's world doing this. And so what happens? Moms don't let their kids out in the front. They want to play in the back, in the fenced-in backyard. They put them in the back of the Suburban and drive them halfway across town for a play date. Guilty. My wife has done that multiple times. And I grew up in neighborhoods where they were more like this. They weren't quite this narrow, but we played hockey in the street or kickball in the street. And the cars drove slow enough that, if a ball went out or a kid was in, you slowed down. This is what I meant earlier about street design. If you want to slow cars down in your residential neighborhoods, narrow the streets. And your fire guys are going to say, no, we can't do it. We got to get our ladder trucks through there. And no, we can't do it because we need if there's cars parked on both sides of the street, we still need 2 lanes of traffic. That's a value discussion. That's ultimately what Chuck ended up resigning from his license for. This is a values discussion. If you want to design safer streets, you slow the cars down, you make it narrower, and people get by just fine. And oh, by the way, that street is a lot cheaper to maintain because it's a lot narrower. But again, when you design the streets right, you get front porches, you get people out on the front porch, they know their neighbors. Jane Jacobs has a quote of eyes on the street. So when people are out in the front yards, they see each other, they know each other, and so there's not that boogeyman that's down the street because everybody knows each other. And you also have more of a comfort as a parent that somebody that lives 2 or 3 houses down is going to look out for your kids, and it's more of a community. It's more of a true neighborhood. We don't design and build neighborhoods very much anymore. We build subdivisions. They're very different. So I mentioned the fiscal stuff, and I'm going to get into some fiscal analysis, land use fiscal analysis that we do to help talk about the value of different development patterns. And this is one of the things that we do. This is property tax revenue per acre mapping. This is Dallas County. And all of this is the property tax revenue that's generated by a property divided by the size of that parcel. Anybody want to guess where downtown Dallas is? Right? But what's interesting about this is as you go first ring, second ring, third ring, suburban communities, has anybody ever been to Cedar Hill? Kind of fast growing, fairly affluent suburban community, right? That's them, right down there. Look at their most valuable stuff compared to this. Look at the difference. This is the most powerful 1-2 punch in our mapping that I do in every community, okay? This is from Brownsville, Texas a couple of years ago. I show this one because it's the most dramatic, but a lot of the cities that we work with show this same trend. This is Brownsville. We did this on an ROI basis, so it's basically for every dollar it costs to serve, what do you get back in property tax? But this shows for current budget, if you just take the city's current budget paid from property tax, and you take the property tax revenue coming in, what's that net for each parcel? And you can see most of the properties in Brownsville are positive. So they're bringing in more property tax revenue than they're costing to serve, right? But remember what I was saying about infrastructure that was built earlier and what it costs, right? We took all of the streets in Brownsville at the time and said, if you were to rebuild them today in today's dollars, what would that cost? Anybody have a guess? What would it take to rebuild all of the streets or roads in Brownsville back in 2017? It's a big city, by the way. 1.3 billion. That's one city. $1.3 billion. Averaged out, I can't remember I think we did over 40, but in the model, it ended up being $65 million a year. They would need to save or spend $65 million a year to have enough to reconstruct all of the roads in their city without any new roads being built. So when we take that cost and we push that back down to the properties, that's what happens. So you go from everything looks good and looks green and looks fiscally productive and positive to, if we really had what we needed in our property tax, which one of the assumptions we make is that the development that you build should generate enough in property tax to pay for the streets. You should not have to use sales tax and other sources to pay for streets. Sales tax, as anybody in economic development, that should go towards growth, that should go towards new projects, that should go towards economic development, quality of life, other things. But what we see, and one of the red flags that we look for, is when your budget starts to shift, that you're using more of your sales tax to cover basic general fund costs. You're starting to subsidize the development pattern with other revenues. And that's not a bad thing. In good times, when your sales tax is kicking it, that's a good thing, but that's also fragile when sales tax goes away. So until our laws in Texas change, we are a property tax state. You should be building things that can generate enough property tax revenue to cover the basic costs so that you have those other more volatile sources to go towards other things. But when we have our good years, what we do is lower the tax rate. Instead of keeping that tax rate where it is and putting that in a fund to save it for when we have to replace, or putting it into more preventative maintenance to extend the life of our streets, we cut the tax rate and that money is gone. And then you end up like this. And so then from this, we can start to study, why do certain development patterns hold their value? Why do some go red? Why do some go green? This is from a friend of mine, Linda Ummel. She's been city manager in several different places. Where we worked with her most recently was when she was down in Bastrop, Texas. I don't know if anybody is familiar with Bastrop's development code, the B3 code. They've gotten a lot of awards for it. But the fiscal modeling that we did in Bastrop before that code was kind of what teed it up. And it basically was a big shift from business as usual development to, we have to protect our core and build a lot more traditional grid development to be fiscally sustainable. But this is what Linda said on a podcast that we did with her a few years ago. She said, most city managers understand they have a resource gap, but when it's not quantified and shared publicly, it's easy to defer to next year. Once you put a number to it and you see how large that number is, it creates an ethical obligation and urgency to address it immediately, right? We don't put this number, we don't put that infrastructure funding gap in front of our community. I'm gonna call my buddy Jim here, and then I might come to Rick too, because I know you've been in this spot as well. But you've been in public works. We got to know each other when you were working in public works. You knew this number was big. But why did it not make it from public works to city management? And why did it not make it from city management to council? And why did it not make it from council to the community?
I've been in a situation where I brought that number forward and basically been told that we can't talk about that. Plain and simple.
By the city manager or by council?
Yeah, by city managers that I've worked for.
And
in some places, I was successful in bringing that number forward, and the result would be ramping up of the engineering funding.
Right.
Right, because it said, okay, what is it? The exercise you went through with Brownsville, right, to figure out what that number was. My guess was $1 billion. I didn't shout it out, but
yeah,
I know
you,
fairly well
yeah.
as well. And those numbers are scary, and it, creates hysteria, right?
Yeah.
And it's contrary to, in this part of the world, the philosophical need to reduce taxes. I tell people I don't want to pay any more taxes than I have to as well, but I'm willing to pay my fair share to what's in it.
Yeah.
So my pitch has always been fix the right roads at the right time versus wait until they come to catastrophic failure.
Right.
Right. But there's always pushback because it's like, well, we don't have to do that this year. To Linda's point, I worked with Linda.
Yeah.
I worked with Linda for a couple
She's a
of
bulldog.
years.
Yeah, it's it really is, and it's still, we continue to see, even places that we work that we've done some of this exercise, you still see, well, that's out there. That's not my problem. That's a future council member's problem. And this stuff helps get more people on board with change and ways to talk about how to generate more revenue or to reduce costs or to extend the life of infrastructure. But there's still always people on the resident side. There's people that say, well, I don't care what happens 10 years from now, because as soon as my kids are gone, I'm out of here. I'm going to move somewhere else. And I'm starting to say, well, where? Because this problem is starting to happen. When it's happening in Texas, it's happening everywhere, because we are the last ones to go. You go outside of Texas, and pretty much everywhere is already in the middle of this mess, right? We just have parts of Texas that are in the mess. So we can still, in Texas, we can leave one place and go to another new shiny Anna or Gunner or any of your communities, and you're going to get more, because the first and the second ring places are going to start to struggle. Where a Richardson or a Garland, some of those communities are struggling today. Those folks moved out a ring, and then when the next ring starts to suffer, they're going to move out again. So three options here generally that we talk about to close the resource gap. The first one is you can keep your development pattern exactly the same. Everybody can have the same quality of life, same lifestyle that they're living, but you are going to have to increase taxes and fees to pay for this stuff long term. Right? You can have the wider roads, you can have lower density, you can have the big boxes and all the things that you want, but you're going to have to pay more because you've been getting a Cadillac and paying for a Yugo, right? Most of you guys know what a Yugo is. There's a few that are probably, it might be a little old for you. Ford Focus, maybe, is that the equivalent of a Yugo? I don't know what today's Yugo is, but we've been in a place, and it's not, this is just the impression that we've allowed to kind of happen, is that you can have the quality of life that we've been having with a $250,000 home or a $300,000 home even. And the reality is, no. When you factor in what it really costs, what cities really need to serve and maintain this stuff over the life cycle of a development, you've got to generate more revenue. Raise your hand if you support more taxes and fees to cover development pattern. So some people will, right? And that's been the outcome of it. When you put it out there and you say this number is coming, so don't hide it anymore. Put it out there to everybody. And don't put it out to just council. Don't put it out to just your planning commission. Don't put it out to just your staff. You've got to put it out to the whole community so you're all speaking the same language. You're all fighting the same fight. And then you say, we have a big wave of costs that are coming our way in 5 years, in 10 years, in 40 years, whatever it is, whatever stage you're in your community. And how are we going to close this gap? Some people will say, I'll pay a little bit more in taxes as long as I know it's going to certain things. Don't go blow it on fill in the blank, right? That's one of the concerns. But there's also, I mentioned earlier, a lot of people that are starting to get priced out, and they may want to say, sure, I'll pay more, but they can't. So it's willing and able. You have to be willing to pay more, and you have to be able to pay more. And it's that able to pay more that is probably the other side of the equation that we're talking about even more now as values continue to go up. So not a lot of people like the first option. The second option is, okay, we're going to keep tax rates and costs where they are. We're going to cut services to align with the money that we have. That's what we do today. Every year in budgeting, we say, here's the revenue we're expecting to get, and we match our budget to that number. And anything we can't cover, what do we do? Rick, what do we do when we can't cover something in this year's budget? Push it to next year, right? And then next time we do a capital improvement program and we look at all the list of the projects that we need to do, and we say, wow, we just did a big, huge bond program 5 years ago to knock out 10 million or 100 million, whatever it was. And then you look at your list again a few years later, and that number is doubled. And then we do another bond election, and people pay and they say, oh, we fixed all these streets. You fixed 2% of the streets in your city, right? And then you do another bond election. And every time you do it, the citizens are like, we just did a bond election. We paid for this stuff. We paid for this stuff. But your liabilities are getting bigger and bigger and bigger. So you can reduce them in the short term, but ultimately it's going to bite you in the butt. Your neighborhoods are going to start to tank. You're going to have to start to make choices of which neighborhoods do we invest in and which ones do we let go. And ultimately, the people who have the resources to move out will. They'll move somewhere else. And the people that are left in those neighborhoods, you get that cycle of decline, right? They can't afford to stay there. They can't afford to move around, and you start to see some of the unfortunate things that we've seen in other parts of the country. And why so many people are moving to Texas now. It's a big reason people are moving here is it is affordable. You can get a good quality of life at an affordable price. Because Texas is the last place in this country on this development curve. We have the most new greenfield development of anywhere in the country, maybe Florida, although Florida got gun shy after they built a whole bunch of stuff pre-last recession and still have empty lots sitting there from 15 years ago. The third option here, and this is the one that we try to talk about, is how can we develop differently? How can we develop responsibly in a way that aligns these things together? Is there a way to develop where you can sustain these additional costs, these additional service costs, without raising the tax rate? The answer is yes. There is a way to do it, and it's the development pattern, right? So this is, again, the fiscal analysis. I'm going to dig a little bit deeper and show a couple of examples of where we did this. This is the first thing. We have to get away from appraised value, and we have to get more to revenue per acre. You have to look at the tax productivity of a development based on the size of the land that it's on. This is Dallas County. Again, on the left is just appraised value. So if we look at any property and we say, what is this property worth? The darker the green there, the higher the value, right? That doesn't take into account how big the lot is. It's just a dollar value. So you could have something that's dark green, but it could be on a really small lot or it could be on a really big lot. It doesn't really tell you a whole lot. When you put it in terms of tax revenue per acre, you get the map on the right. Is anybody familiar enough with the whole Dallas conversation about the lack of investment in South Dallas? There is no map that I have seen that shows this issue more clearly than that one. Right? 35, 75, that development in the middle, that is where all of the wealth in Dallas County has been, is continuing to be, because that's where all the investment is going. So as a county, you still have that whole area to serve. You still have roads and services in that, in that whole county, in those other cities, but that by itself is a big aha for folks. Let's talk about the value of different development patterns, different lot sizes. This is an example of a 2,000 square foot home on 3 different lot sizes. The one on the left, 3,000 square foot lot, 5,000, and then on the right's the biggest lot. If you do the property tax per acre calculation, that home on the small lot has over double the value, the tax revenue per acre of the one on the big lot, right? How many of you have had conversations in your community with your council that bigger lots, we want bigger lots because bigger lots are more valuable? Raise your hand. I know most of you have had that conversation, right? Bigger lots are not always the most valuable to your city. It has to do with the building footprint. It has to do with the amount of house on the land, and it also has to do with the width of the lot and how many lots you get on a block of street. And this is just one factor. There's more factors that go into this, of course, but this just so the point of this slide is to show the building footprint. The more building you put on the land, the higher value per acre you're going to get. Same thing applies when you go vertical, right? Again, the more building you put on a property, the higher value per acre you're going to get. So Simple example of this is a single family neighborhood. Everything's the same, streets the same, all that, right? 1-story house versus a 2-story house. 2-story house is worth more, right? So it's generating, most of the time, the 2 stories are on the same size lots as the 1 stories. Not all the time, but anytime you go 2 stories, you generate a little more. I think, I've never tested this, but if you could pass one thing in your code and say that your entire city is required to be a minimum of 2 stories, I think you would pencil out. He's saying no. You don't think so?
Depends on the age of the population.
The age and the population?
2-story, not older people.
Accessible, right? Yeah. So, and there's other issues of accessibility. There's still affordability issues, but if you could do 2-story, just the 2-story, going from 1 to 2-story, especially on commercial stuff, the ones that drive me bonkers is think of all the strip centers we build and all the commercial that we build that is a 1-story building, but it almost has a 2nd story because they build all that. I guess it's for aesthetic reasons. Some of it's HVAC, I guess. But even if you could just take commercial buildings, so let's take residential out of it. Just take commercial out of it and put a 2nd story on top of your commercial. Whether it's offices, whether it's apartments to rent out or whatever, just put a 2nd story on top of that. It would go a long way. But the 1-story spread out, big lot, big parking lot is killing our cities. This is a little more. This is from Taylor, Texas, down by Austin. Taylor is a place we just finished up their comprehensive plan with the folks at Lionheart a few months ago, right before they announced the Samsung. They got the big Samsung plant. But we were going through a comprehensive plan process with their community, and we did some of this analysis, and these are some of the examples that we'll show when we do work in different cities. So this is on the left, a Main Street, 1 block of just Main Street mixed use, basically 20, 25 foot wide lots, 1 to 2-story, pretty modest stuff. That value per acre there, it's three quarters of an acre area footprint. That value per acre is almost $16,000, just property tax. We're not talking sales tax yet. On the right is a similar piece of land, still 3/4 of an acre, Jack in the Box, and that one generates $7,000 an acre. This one over here on the right got a lot of subsidies, a lot of incentives to come to town. Those are also the kind of things that are there for 15, 20 years and then they go away. We've all seen the Whataburger or the Dairy Queen or the Burger King or one of those that is no longer there, right? When a business goes out on the left, a new one can come in, right? The infrastructure, the development framework can stay the same. So it's more resilient and flexible from a development standpoint and a market standpoint as well. Again, the point with all, I always like to say, the point with all of this is not that there's one or the other. It's just another data point to think about when you're considering development because we've been skewed so far to the right. This zooms out a little bit. This is their downtown, a little over 10 acres. One entire block of this is open space. Doesn't generate any tax base to the city at all. It's an exempt property, just adds value to that part of downtown. That generates, including that one whole block that doesn't generate tax, that overall area generates $12,000 per acre in property tax. The big box on the right is almost twice the land footprint and 1/3 of the property tax per acre. This is usually where someone will say, but, what about sales tax, right? Sales tax does come into play here, but in most cases, sales tax follows the same trend as property tax. The more people you put in an area, the more revenue you're gonna get. The more people you put in an area, the more demand for commercial you're gonna get and more sales tax you're gonna get out of it. I don't know if any of you guys work with the guys at Zach Tax for sales tax numbers, but Patrick and Chad are good friends and we've been talking about this too. We're looking for a few places to kind of drill down, and you can't get sales tax to the same parcel level that you can for property tax, but we can get close. We can get close. But generally, it does follow the same trend. The more people you put in an area, the more demand and revenue you're gonna get. When you look at all of those businesses combined on the left, all of those smaller businesses, they generate similar to what the big box does. So again, you don't need, it's not a one or the other. It's just, you have to understand the costs, the long-term costs especially, and the cost of consuming land for unproductive uses like the big parking lots. This is one more from Pflugerville outside of Austin. Same thing, you got two big boxes on either side that are a little, the one on the left is 4,000 an acre, the one on the right 6,000 an acre, and the little dinky one block of Main Street that they have is 13,000 an acre. This is from Waxahachie that we're doing a comprehensive plan with right now, south of Dallas, fast growing place. Home values are skyrocketing there. This is probably the second most popular slide from these presentations that people want to hang on to. What this shows is along the bottom here, these are your single family lot sizes. So this is your smallest, 2/10 of an acre, all the way up to over an acre on the right. And then the height of those green bars is the average home value on the properties of that size in the city. So the higher bar, the higher value the home is. And then that red line is the revenue per acre. So what we see, and this trend has held true in every city that we've modeled. Every single one has had this same trend. The smallest lots are the most affordable housing, and they're the highest revenue per acre to the city. So if you're talking about building affordable housing, if you're talking about wanting to increase your value per acre and capture some more tax revenue to close the gap, building the smaller lots is a way to do it. What we tend to build is a whole bunch of this. 4/10, half acre lots. Their average value on those lots was 180. It's obviously going up now. But we build a lot of that right now, and that is really hard to sustain fiscally unless you get it 400, 450,000 a home. And then again, it's not, at that point, it's not the cost of sustaining the cost to your city. It's an affordability question of how many people can afford to be in that home. Is it 450 and then it goes to 500 and up from there? We slice and dice this kind of stuff all the time, so we can show by zoning district, we can show by neighborhood, we can drill down and show how different patterns behave. And again, that's all to just show people kind of here's how these different patterns perform in terms of tax productivity. And if you want to capture additional revenue without changing the tax rate, change the development pattern to some of these patterns that are more fiscally productive, and you can start to balance it out. What is the lot size and the width of the street? What's the impact on the homeowner's tax? So this is 70 foot lots, a 31 foot wide street, and that comes out to roughly $19,000 per lot for the cost of that street. I'm gonna wait for you. And then if we just go down to 50 foot lots and a 27 foot street, so we like to use a number of, for an 11 foot lane mile. For 1 mile of an 11 foot lane, it's anywhere between $1 to $1.5 million to replace it. So if you think of your street in front of your house, if you shaved 5 feet off the width of that street, you could save $500,000 a mile just by reducing your street by 5 feet. So this is kind of the steps of the modeling that we do, and this has evolved over time as we've done more of these, as we've done workshops and we've worked with different cities and we get feedback and questions and challenge and they want to see different numbers, what have you. This is the basic process that we'll go through now. We'll start with the property tax revenue per acre and just show what are you bringing in. Then we load in your current budget. So what are you currently spending from your general fund? The portion of general fund paid by property tax, and that gets kind of the first red-green map, or the profit and loss map is what some people call it. That's kind of what you have today. And then the third thing we do is load in those unfunded costs. So we take the unfunded streets. If there's other general fund costs, sometimes cities will say, we really need another, X million or whatever the number is for additional, just service, public safety, libraries, parks and rec, whatever it may be. Different cities do different things, but we always put the unfunded streets in there as a base when we load in those unfunded costs to kind of model what you really need. So you have, here's what you're bringing in, here's how things balance out just for current budget, and then here's what things look like when you factor in what is unfunded right now, but what you really need. This is a couple more from Taylor to show what that looks like. This is their growth pattern, their annexation. They started out, same thing. They had a small square in the middle up until 1954. And then after 1954, they decided to go crazy and annex all willy-nilly in all different directions, right? This is how their population has grown over time, and their density. They've kind of jumped up. They were, back in 1960, they were 1.4 people per acre. They went up to 1.6, and then they started to drop back down. And then in the comp plan, they said, we want to add more people. We want to add more density to try to close the gap. This is their street cost. This is what it looks like for Taylor. Their number was 124 million, 125 million, smaller city. And theirs came out to roughly 4.5, or a deficit of 4.5 million per year. But there's kind of another thing that we'll do is break it up in 5 years or 10-year increments, so you can kind of see when those costs are coming. When we did the one for Brownsville, they had that 1.3 billion, 600 million of it was in poor or failed condition. It was already gone and needed to be fixed right away. In Taylor, they're not quite there yet. And in a lot of your communities, your liabilities are going to show up way out here. So the question is, what do you do between now and 2040 to have that money when you need it? This was their tax revenue per acre. That's their current budget. That's with the street costs. This was their land use analysis. So we looked at it by single family, multifamily, different lot sizes. Same thing showed up, that whether it was single family, the smallest lots stayed positive, the bigger lots went negative. Multifamily, the smaller lots stayed positive. Commercial, the same thing. So we can show this different ways in maps and charts. This was their highest producing property in the whole city. This nice little 2-story building on the corner. What's interesting about this is this little dinky 1-story barbershop right next to it was like number 12. Like, you would never look at that and say, wow, that's one of the most valuable properties in the city. But from a property tax revenue per acre standpoint, it was the 12th most productive property in the entire city of Taylor. That blew people's mind. And it all had to do with the narrow lot. It's a 10-foot lot, and it's got full building coverage. That was the trick. So one of the things that we propose, and no matter where you are, is to close the gap, is infill. Right, you grow from the inside out, you add density in the inside. Typically your downtown and around that can handle a little more density. That's the more walkable place where people are willing to walk and have different size homes and businesses and things located together. Your downtown is always the best place to do that. There's always a lot of vacant lots or older properties that are in need of some reinvestment there that you can get a pretty significant bump without adding more cost. This is just one example in Taylor. Vacant lot, fully served, had water, sewer, inside city limits, police, fire, the whole deal. It was just a vacant lot. They put a little duplex on it, and it bumped the value. You do that property after property, you can start to close your gap. In the planning process, what we did, there was 2 scenarios that we looked at. One was the current trend of, let's take Taylor and continue to build the new stuff out around the edge, like most of our communities are doing, right? We want to build more single family out around the edge. We want some of the big box stuff, and that's what everybody said in the very first survey that they wanted. We did the math, we did the analysis, we had a workshop and a series of community presentations to show the numbers, and then we said, here's the other alternative. What if we prioritized infill, and we prioritized what development approach would be the most fiscally sustainable and maximize the tax productivity without raising the tax rate? We showed them that scenario. 83% of the respondents in that city picked the infill scenario. Blew council's mind. They're like, we had no idea. And on top of it, it was, you can preserve, what do you want? We want to preserve the small town character of Taylor. That's the old traditional development pattern that you have downtown. We want to have a mix of a choice of housing of different shapes and sizes and price points for different people at different ages and stages of life. That's the old downtown pattern of development. And oh, by the way, it's the most fiscally productive in terms of maximizing infrastructure and tax productivity out of the footprint. So this, in the end of the plan, kind of what came out of it is something called growth sectors. This is something that we use policy-wise to guide the growth. So you prioritize infill, you prioritize growth from the inside out. You basically say as a city, if you want to come into the infill area, we're going to help you build this kind of stuff. If you want to go out in what we call the controlled growth area, you can still develop out there, but you have to do it to certain standards in a certain way. And then there's parts of the city that even it may be in the city limits, but we are not going to invest any city dollars in infrastructure in that area in the next 10 or 20 years. And so that's called the area of limited growth. I was really curious to see what would happen in Taylor when we got to this point. Would the staff and would council stand up if someone that was in city limits came forward and said, well, I'm in city limits, I have the right to develop. And it happened, both from property owners and a couple of realtors that were trying to work some deals on some land. And the council and the staff responded, you have the right to develop there, but it's on your cost. We are not going to extend city infrastructure to that area in this next growth period for Taylor, because that's not the most responsible use of our taxpayer dollars. And they pointed back to the fiscal analysis of why. Those people were a little upset. They were expecting that the city would punch a road out to them and punch the sewer out to them so that they could develop. But that was the case of the city doing what was best for the whole community and taxpayers instead of a few. And they leaned on this fiscal number to help them do that. Ultimately, we modeled a couple of different, at a high level, future build out scenarios for them to show, if you build and add population according to the growth sectors over time, what do your numbers look like? So that they could more strategically close that gap over time. So a couple things, last things to wrap up with, just a couple of specific kind of the how-to part of this. We used to do this, we would do I would do these kind of talks about the why and talk about the problem. And at the end of it, I would get, oh, okay, we hear you, Kevin, smarty pants, there's a problem, what are we gonna do? And I realized we have to come with the other side of this. Once you get people nodding and saying, okay, we got to change stuff, we've got to be able to come with you. Here's some things you can actually do right now to close the gaps. So these are kind of the principles we use in all the planning work that we do. Fiscally sustainable development, self-sustaining local economy and workforce, culture of trust and collaboration, which is a huge one right now, and human scale neighborhoods. The culture of trust and collaboration, every planning project that we're doing right now, we ask the questions about what do you want the city to be when they grow up, and what kind of things would you like to see, and all of that. And when we ask what are your biggest concerns, or give us your top 3 concerns or something like that. Number 1 or 2, mostly 1, a few places it was number 2, is lack of trust and communication with the city government. People do not trust what their city is doing. And you go to city and they're like, we try, we put the information out, and they just don't want to, they don't want to read they don't want to go to the website, they don't want to read the information. Bottom line is there's a gap. There's a communication and a trust gap, and whatever you're doing in your community is not enough. Now, some of that is on citizens too. I think they need to do a little bit more, but cities are going to have to lead here, because you're not going to be able to count on the residents to do that, or maybe they're going to start their own blog and start writing about their little perspective of the world, which that's not always healthy either. The first thing at a very high level of your city is this: you've got to, excuse me, you've got to integrate land use and mobility design. Land use and mobility are directly connected. If you build in an auto-centric pattern, you're going to have no choice, but you have to build more and wider roads. Right? If you build in a more compact pattern with a mix of uses, you can actually take cars off of the road. We've started to see this a little bit with the COVID thing, of when people were at home, our roads, our traffic counts were not as high. In Waxahachie right now, one of the things we're doing with that plan is we looked at traffic counts in 2017 pre-COVID, and we looked at traffic counts now, and they're roughly a third of what they were. So in the pre-model, they might have needed 4 lanes in the 2017 model. In the new model, they need 2 lanes. And so it's kind of which one leads, but if you can design more complete neighborhoods where people can do more things closer to home, they don't have to drive as much, you don't need the wider roads. So those are directly connected. Streets, roads, stroads. Stroads is another term from Chuck and Strong Towns. It's a street-road hybrid, what Chuck calls the futon of transportation. So futon, it tries to be a couch, not very well, right? It tries to be a bed. Anybody tried to sleep on a futon? Doesn't work, right? So it tries to do both. It kind of sucks at both. A stroad is the same thing. It tries to be a street, which is a platform for growth and interaction and human interaction, exchange, doing business. And a road is intended to be a high-speed connection between two places, right? A stroad is the futon of transportation. It tries to be a street. We put restaurants and businesses up and down both sides, right? It tries to be a street. We put sidewalks on our thoroughfares. Has anybody ever walked on a sidewalk next to one of your thoroughfares? Stupidest, I do not, I understand like some people don't have cars and they have to walk, and that's always the argument we hear is we're trying to connect our cities, but that's not fair. No, I mean, nobody's gonna walk or ride a bike, right next to cars that are going 50 miles an hour. So either look at your transportation system and design them as roads to move vehicles quickly, meaning eliminate your median cuts, try to reduce the signals, try to reduce the pedestrian interaction, the crossings, things like that, or build streets that are more for people to, if you're driving, you drive slow, more people to get out of their car, those kind of things. We're starting to see some changes here as well. Building complete neighborhoods. This is a graphic from my friends at TBG that I think are some of the best in master plan community design, but whether it's new neighborhoods like this one, you have to build that diversity of housing. You've got to build cottages and townhomes and duplex and fourplex and single family and large estates. You've got to build them all inside the same neighborhoods. Think of it like this: 3 to 4 generations of a family should be able to live within walking distance of each other. If you want to be a long-term sustainable city, 3 to 4 generations of a family should be able to live within walking distance of each other. Because if they can't, they're separating, maybe they have to go to a different city altogether to find housing for them. But you've got to look at more complete a mix of residential and then also mixing in some commercial, the neighborhood coffee shops in there as well. If it's an older neighborhood or an existing neighborhood, how can you retrofit it over time to be more like this? Affordable and resilient neighborhoods, a big part of it is housing. You've got to build this whole missing middle spectrum of housing. You got to look at, we're doing a much better job of walkable communities, better designed public space for healthy living, things like that. That graphic on the left is from Blue Zones. They've done a lot of work over in Fort Worth. But yeah, the housing diversity and the complete neighborhoods kind of go together. Public space resource stewardship, using our public space more intentionally for not just for amenities and recreation, but also for functional stormwater management. A good buddy of mine, Michael Wilkins, used to work with us for a while. One of the best in the business, I think, at integrated stormwater management and designing things in a way that manage flooding, manage stormwater, but also create great places that create value for the residents, but also can be an economic development generator. This is probably the biggest one. If you want to close your resource gap, prioritize infill development. This is from Pasadena, Texas, down by Houston. The math always works the same. Find places that are either undeveloped or that are blighted. Look at, in this case, it was kind of more of an overarching effort where they worked to relocate some of the folks that were there to some newer housing, and then they coordinated some infrastructure reconstruction work on the streets, but also worked with a developer to build some row houses in there that added a housing type that they didn't have. So basically the whole value of that neighborhood is they're doing that incrementally with the streets, and the coordinated redevelopment strategy is bumping it up. So they're taking one of the lowest producing parts of the city and making it fiscally positive incrementally by doing these individual lot redevelopment projects. I think this is the last main slide, or one or two left. This is revitalizing aging places. So Monty Anderson is a small developer based in Duncanville that we do a lot of work with. When you go around a lot of the older cities, there's there's places like this. There's always these abandoned strip centers that are dying. There's nobody there. And so what can we do with those to repurpose those to add value back into the neighborhood? This is the planning work and this kind of I don't even know what to call it, but this kind of site development, incremental site redevelopment with locals are probably the two fastest growing parts of our business right now. This is the incremental development money that Monty has developed. You start all the way down at the bottom with a tent market, and then you work your way incrementally up to bigger spaces. Economic development folks are always, not always, but most of them are surprised to explore and see like just the value of this model of building things incrementally of smaller spaces, especially during COVID. People can't afford the bigger spaces, the higher rents. So if they can get into a smaller space to get started, they test out their idea. If it works, they can move up. If their business idea doesn't work, they're not out as much money. There's a lot of different scales to do this. And what I like about what Monty does, there's different developers that build small development. But what Monty always does is he does it with locals. He finds people living in the neighborhood that want, have an idea or that own a property and want to, add an accessory dwelling unit or add a second unit to get a little more personal wealth or whatever. But he finds people in the community and he does these deals with those people so that it revitalizes, and he uses the word gentrification, not gentrification. But it incrementally adds value to the neighborhood and to the city, but it also cultivates the local wealth. So it raises that level of wealth of the people there so that they're able to pay for something a little bit better than they were before. Completely different economic development model. I'm just going to wrap with this one. So the current pattern of development is not financially sustainable. If it is financially sustainable, it's because your home values are so high, and that becomes an affordability issue. So we have to communicate this. We've got to talk about the resource constraints. We got to work within the resource constraints to close the gap and build more affordable and lasting communities. The second one is really important for growing communities. Where, when, and how you add people. And development has a direct relationship to your city's fiscal health. So where, when, and how you add people today is going to have a direct impact on the fiscal health of your city 40 or 50 years from now. So do not think just about, does this all pencil out today? You have to be thinking about the future. And I just think that's the biggest challenge for our city leaders today, is to transition from the mindset that we had before, that just growth is good, and if we're growing, we can lower the tax rate, to we've got to grow smart. Local governments can't dig out of the hole alone. And I apologize, I've had a lot of these lately and I'm losing my voice again. Local governments can't dig out of the hole alone. It takes collaboration with private developers, with the local residents, business partners, local banks especially. The fiscal analysis that I showed you, that has been something that we threw out a few years ago, is just our way of maybe trying to see if we could connect some of these things, and it's just absolutely blown up for us. Like everywhere we go, it sticks. And there's different ways to do it. You can argue like the lot sizes and the values, you can argue sales tax, and we love to dig into that and kind of adjust the dials for every different community. But putting this information out helps you have a more transparent conversation in your community about how to make this sustainable long term. And then anywhere you can prioritize that small development and infill and grow from the inside out, do it now, do it incrementally. You're gonna continue to get some of the bigger growth. When you do that, just look at your design standards and try to get those complete neighborhoods and better quality design and mix of uses than we have in the past. So Molly mentioned our podcast. It's the Go Cultivate podcast. We've been doing it for a couple of years now. It kind of goes up and down as we have time to do them. But that's another thing we started. We have these conversations inside our team, and we're like, these are good conversations. We should maybe share this. And so we started the podcast, and that too has exceeded any expectations I could have had for it. So we have conversations like this. I think Jim has actually been on the podcast once to talk about infrastructure stuff. But we try to have conversations with our team and then do interviews with different folks that are thinking about these challenges. Our website's verdunity.com. You can get our blog there, more information about all of this stuff as well. So that's all I got, and that's good because I have no voice left.